So that was the Vivace number 16 from Giuliani's Op.50. So follow the lesson for free. We're going to talk a little bit about the classical texture and how to approach pieces like this. But if you're interested, I do have an edition of all 32 works in Giuliani's Op.50, and there's a link for that in the description. Like many of the works in Op.50, fairly straightforward way that you would approach this piece. So there's a pretty clear melody or melodic material. So those notes in the upper voice are clearly the melody and the melodic material. Whether you include all of them as in your conception of what the melody is doesn't really matter. But I think that regardless of this first figure, here, it's really just that D. That D is your destination point rather than like that figure there doesn't really matter. I think it's just the D is the melody there. So you can underplay the latter half of that. So so don't pound out those last two notes, but just softly throw those in. Don't make a big deal of that slur. And then we have a very traditional classical era accompaniment figure, an Alberti bass. On the piano, that's where the left hand is playing bass notes and inner chord accompaniment like this, and the right hand's playing melody. On the guitar, the thumb can come out a fair amount, but the eye finger should be really pretty buried in there. So in terms of your hierarchy of the texture, when we're looking at that first bar, we want the melody to be the most prominent. The bass can be pretty resonant though, because it's far away from the melody, but the eye finger should be really soft. You don't want to pound out that inner voice. So melody, bass, and then the inner eye finger accompaniment can be very suppressed. So just take that first full bar and just practice it on a loop. And until you get a texture that you're happy with. Besides that, the whole piece that's pretty much your goal, is to play that melody legato and phrase it the way you want while throwing in the accompaniment. So let's just do a walkthrough and talk about a few of the tiny oddities in the piece. I'll go quite a bit slower. Vivace is pretty fast, but with this piece, you can only go so fast as you can play that melody nicely. So I tried to push the tempo a little bit, but not so much that it takes away from the legato upper line. So the right hand fingering for that main section is just M, M, I, M, I, A, M, I, M, I, A, and the rest are through thumb. I've actually notated that in my edition, so you can take a look at the first bar. I've notated it. Okay. Make sure on bar 4 you're sustaining that note, that melody note, until the figure starts again. And then I just play this M-I, M-I, to get back into the M-I fingering. In places like into bar 13, you might have to lift your third finger off just a hair early, but do it after you've played the E. That way you can get the next chord. Slight compromise there. And second finger on F there so you can sustain everything. bar 12. Bar 12 is a measure that you might want to repeat a couple of times on loop just to get the feeling into the right hand. I play that with I and A, and then land with PM, sorry. So, I, A, PM. You don't want to make a big deal of that, even though it's like from a technical standpoint, it's just something you might want to get used to, but you don't want it to stand out, so loop that until you feel like you can go through that measure very smoothly without drawing attention to that figure too much. So I'll slow down. So let's talk about measure 15. So as we approach measure 15, on the open E, you probably will lift your first finger to get that next F. That's a small compromise. That's okay. When you're playing this, as soon as you play the upper D in measure 15, I would lift these two fingers off of the chord. Although it's ideal to sustain the chord to the last minute, the next two notes are with 3 and 2, and that's the most common place where students will have a gap in their legato. So, you know, you've got the bass sustaining, you've got the last note sustaining, and you're just going to lift these fingers when you play the D. That way you can grab the next chord. And again, it's a small compromise for your overall legato, right? Instead of sustaining every note to the very end, you're going to lift those two fingers, which isn't noticeable, but then you'll get the next chord right in time without a hiccup. And then you're home free, it's the same figure as before. Just do a little bit of a slow down or a rit. And that's it. So a fairly straightforward piece, very good example of the classical texture on the classical guitar. Just a few places to practice and to get your balance correct, but otherwise a very pleasant piece. Push the tempo as much as you can, but without sacrificing the legato on your melody.